Brabazon, and welcome to our Conversations with Professor Priscilla Dunk-West. This week we have a request to talk about women, visibility and leadership. What a truly great suggestion. You see, leadership, when poured into the vessel of a white man, makes people comfortable. And there are reasons for that. Think about all the ideologies that are carried by masculinity. Strength, competence, intelligence, work ethic. Now, these ideologies are part of patriarchy, but have also been transformed through the Industrial Revolution, and indeed the post-industrial neoliberalism that currently punctuates our societies. But through all the discussions of the manosphere, the Andrew Tates, the Jordan Petersons, is there space to consider a different way of thinking about leadership that unravels so many of the ideologies of the last 200 years? Let's talk with Priscilla and find out. Okay, Priscilla, this is it. This is the week. This is the important conversation. And look, most of us, I mean, I'm so much older than you and close to death, but most of us have memories of our undergraduate and our postgraduate days of men in leadership at our universities. Suits, mostly with ties. And indeed, what I find so interesting looking back on all of this is that gender wasn't even a question that was asked or of concern, because leaders were men and men were leaders. So for all the people who have been requesting this session and listening to our session today, why do you think it was so difficult a decade ago for women to occupy leadership positions in our universities?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I kind of think it's still a problem. Like it's still something that persists. So I think that women, it's that middle management sort of stuff, I think, where women are often, in the middle. But yeah, you're right. Back then, I think, I started my undergrad in 1990 and it just was, right? It wasn't even a question of, it just was. And in fact, it wasn't until I went to university that, in those early years, I got introduced to the concept of gender and sexism. And, it really made me go, what? And I remember thinking, I haven't experienced sexism before. And then actually going down that path of kind of having my consciousness raised around the very, at that time, unspoken structures that were in place to enable men to be running the world and running universities. And so I think we have still a hangover of that. If I think of all the senior leaders, look at vice-chancellors and deputies vice-chancellors, some diversity, but not a lot. We've still got such a long way to go. And I do think the visuals of who's in leadership is important in that sense. And so I think, I think it goes back to the way that we value knowledge and whose voices have been heard. And in research, we know that that's been, pale, stale, male. Yeah. We know that there's a pattern to the way that we've privileged information and knowledge from particular people who we've positioned as experts. And so that kind of trickles through, right? The way that we value knowledge in a way that is geared towards the pure sciences. That's what we respect and see as in terms of expertise. And so that sense of constructing expertise in that particular way really is, ripples through the way that we reward people by judging them by criteria that's set through those very, very pure sciences, rational, masculine kind of ways of thinking and doing.
Yeah, really brittle metrics and citation metrics. And you've just said something remarkable there. You are incredibly, so much younger than me. But when I started my undergraduate degree, which I think was in 1987, so I'm that much older than you. But can I say we never questioned it? That history by training, 90% of the students were young women and 90% of the academics were men. And that question never even emerged. So we're living all these years later with academics trained in that system that are now starting to say, you know what, that wasn't right. And the problem we've got, and I really want your answer to this one, we hear the cliche that the worst leaders we've ever worked for in higher education were women. Now, I can certainly think of a few examples, and in my personal experience, that's pretty accurate. But I also think it's really easy to forget about that cliche, that great metaphor that's used about the glass labyrinth. I've always loved that as a trope and a metaphor, which is women, when we enter academic life, we're in a labyrinth. It's a glass labyrinth, so we know where we want to go, but we just can't get there. So the journey is so much longer for women in leadership. So by the time we all get into a leadership post, we're a bit bruised, we're a bit angry, we're a bit cross. And so that's perhaps why some of the women leaders are, quite agitated and brittle and indeed bruised. But how can we care for our future women, the women that we're training, so that their pathways are not so arduous and long and difficult?
I think we've got to tear down that labyrinth, right? I think we've got to ask women not to do the work of coming up with the solution, but actually people who inhabit those spaces, who reify and recreate and hold in those walls, they should be doing the work, right? That's the work that needs to be done. So that there needs to be a recognition that, what does the senior leadership look like in your institution? How diverse is it and why? It's not an accident. The system's working exactly how it was designed to work. I mean, that's, you've got to, it's not accidental. It's a deliberate exclusion of particular people. Yeah. And so I think, we've got to stop asking ourselves as women, how can we help other women? Absolutely, we ought to. And I agree with you about, it's like the Thatcher kind of effect, right? It's the, thinking about Thatcher and thinking, oh, but she was a woman, therefore she should be blah, 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 blah. So it's not, it's about representation, but it's also about the structures that enable a certain kind of leadership. And so it really has us, then it should be having us think about what does it mean to hold up ideas of inclusion alongside ideas of having to command or direct or, lead from that top-down way of thinking. How can we think about, hierarchy in new ways? How can we think about collectivism and collaboration? And how can we think about universities while I'm at it on my radical kind of rant? As how do we reject notions of universities as business and think about public good? And so really tackling those issues. But that requires collectivism, right? It requires people kind of getting together and thinking about how do we want our institutions to look, and how do we want people to experience those institutions, both as students but as staff members. We're all part of that community of universities. And so thinking about that and buying into that as a community of people, whether you are staff or students, thinking about what that might look like and what does it look like to be an inclusive place, I think is where we have to continue those conversations. We've been thinking about universities for, since they commenced, right? Thinking about how they operate and what the point of them is and how they ought to operate for such a long time. And I think we have to continue to do that in a really transparent and collaborative way.
And consciousness matters so much to this conversation, I think, Priscilla, mate, because we need to see power. We need to understand what power is and how it looks like, and how people who have by many criteria failed have gone on to be successful in particular patriarchal structures. Remember I'm writing this book on failure literacy at the moment, so I'm a bit obsessed by failure, but also the notion of what is seen to be success, and that success is then promoted, has constructed our current system, and that's exactly what you've stated. So consciousness about what exists now and what alternatives are available. And therefore, I want us to help people listening to this conversation today. I want people angry, I want people conscious, and I want people motivated. But noting your incredibly diverse career, what advice would you offer to women who are listening to this? And I'm hoping also our non-binary and trans colleagues that we'll talk about in a second. But what advice would you offer to women considering a leadership role, wanting leadership in our universities? And are there professional development strategies or options that you would recommend? What's worked for you?
I would love to have started my career and continued my career by going, I'm going to do this, like looking forward, I'm going to do this is what I'm going to do. But I feel like I stumbled around a lot, kind of going, oh, this is quite nice, and to be led by what I was interested in, which is, one way to do it. So I think, do what you love doing. Try to be aware that whatever you do, because in academic appointments, we have choices to some extent about the things that we have to be involved in. So being on committees, some of those service roles, just be aware when there's a role or a task that you're doing or you're spending your time doing that is invisible, that is, umbrellaed under somebody else's workload or counted for somebody else, or somebody else is going to not take the credit but maybe take the credit for your hard work. And so it's that trap that women can fall into, because often women are the ones who are associated with teaching and with students. Therefore, in a system that privileges other kinds of expertise, would get punished or overlooked in promotions. So, thinking about that work and being able to articulate what it is that you're doing in that role. So if you're on a teaching and learning committee, what are you doing? What can you say you've achieved through that role? How can you give examples of influences that you've had? Thinking about those, thinking about how you would structure it in terms of the way that you describe yourself as an academic. So how does it fit with your existing work? That kind of narrative of yourself. Yeah, those, I think, making sure that the work you do isn't invisible. I think that's a frustrating, erosive sort of process that can happen in universities, particularly with women, because often, early career academics will be really enthusiastic and, I'll do that, or I can do that, or put your hand up, which is fabulous. We want that. We want energy and enthusiasm and passion. But think about, when you're making those decisions, thinking about, does this, serve me, I guess, and does it, is it something that I can talk about as an achievement for myself, or does it bring me something in return, or does it lead me towards something? Does it align with where I'm going?
I think that's crucial. So what Priscilla said there is really an archetype for success. It's taking an example, actually taking an event that happens in your life and rendering it an example, and then rendering it a story of achievement. So it's actually taking a singular event and making it meaningful. And as Priscilla stated, the crucial thing is, particularly for women, don't get locked in what I call operational committees. Get yourself into governance committees as quickly as you can. And look, my final question, I've taken so much of your time today, but I wanted to finish talking about something I believe in passionately, and I know you do as well, and that is rainbow leadership. Now, there's so little representation of the rainbow communities in leadership literature. Now, I remember a decade ago in the United Kingdom, it was like front page news that a gay man had become, of course he was a white gay man had become a vice-chancellor at a British university. And look, I've been collecting and researching this fantastic literature about lesbians and in leadership, mainly from the United States. But I've noticed that trans scholars and trans leaders remain so often marginalised and invisible in the literature. So what strategies would you recommend to our universities to build those pathways for those diverse leaders in higher education? And what are the benefits of this type of diversity?
Well, I mean, I've talked about this before, but I think organisations that have diversity are better for it, right? On a name, and you can measure that, and they're more creative, they're more responsive, they're more agile, innovative, and so you need diversity. You need different people with different skills who are different. And I guess in universities, have a look at your materials. Have a look at who's in your senior leadership. Look at a photo of yourself. Look at people's bios.
Look at yourself in the mirror.
Have a look at yourself. And I remember when this happened with students and marketing, right? That, you know, people became aware, what message are we giving to students when they come to this institution? Is this a diverse group of students? And so I guess, you know, I'm a queer woman. There is a thing for queer people that you can't be it if you can't see it. True. And so that visibility is super important, and super important in universities as well, given what I was saying before about, you know, the who's in power, who's at the top, who's in the senior leadership. I guess the other thing that universities can do is not only apply the lens that they apply to marketing, looking at students, but also apply it to themselves. But think about the ways that diversity is accounted for in taking an intersectional lens. So, you know, disabled folk, is your organisation culturally diverse? And asking yourself the hard questions. How would we know what it would be like for a queer person to work in this space? Where are does the space feel welcoming? What is the culture? You know, how do we signal that? I remember I went to one university and started there, and I saw a set of rainbow steps, and I felt instantly, this is safe. You know, this feels like a safe space. Yeah. So those visuals are really important.
Wow.
But also the way that people are treated and their experiences within that space. So yeah, intersectionality all the way. I think we should be thinking about creating institutions that enable diversity. You know, I don't know that universities are great at this.
No.
It doesn't feel like it's a priority at the moment. And I think that we could do so much better. I think we've come some way with students, thinking about students, but yeah, I think staff experiences we still have some way to come. And, you know, it can be through hiring processes, it can be through, you know, looking at people's marketing when they're trying to attract, you know, high caliber applicants, which lots of universities do. So there's lots of different sort of, you know, ways, but it's got to come from senior leadership so that there is a commitment to diversity.
And it's also about every single human being taking accountability and responsibility for that too, because obviously we've got remarkable lesbians, gay men, and that representational focus is integral and crucial. But also the notion that the burden of representation must be on these remarkable humans singly really distresses me. So
yes,
because I'm an old stroppy fag hag, I have a tendency of going into meetings and saying, why are the only people in this meeting straight? Why is everybody in this room heterosexual? Can I have an answer to that? And it's about every single human being taking responsibility and saying, we have failed in diversity in this room, and what are we going to do today to address this so we make better decisions? Because what we're showing by who's in this room is we haven't made good decisions so far.
Yeah, beautiful. And also recognising when that happens that this is a kind of somewhat cynical view, but it's when you have one type of person, when you have one group of people, it's not an accident.
No.
It's actively designed that way. It's working and so, taking responsibility for that and saying, okay, yep, sure, historically we've had, institutionalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. Let's embrace our newer ways of thinking, which frankly young people are fabulous at doing. Let's get into the to the real world here.
And let's make a decision today to make better decisions, because it's about consciousness. But then consciousness is great, but then we have to do something, and the people in leadership and training need to make better decisions. So I thank you for this conversation. You've blown my head off once more, and I hope it really helps people, because I know in this era at the moment everyone's feeling completely helpless and they're feeling pointless and wandering around the landscape going, what are we going to do? That's why this week your incredible advice, I think, will help people take one step and then another and then make better decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you.